Good evening, and welcome to the 7th night of our NavRatri celebrations. I've just come back from temple for the first time since the second lockdown here in New Zealand, so it seemed an excellent time to commence with recording a reading of our Kalratri tribute piece. You often hear it said, time is on our side. Well, this is time. She is on my side. The 7th night of NavRatri is dedicated to Ma as Kalratri, the blackest night, the night of death, the iron night, the stillness of time, and the destroyer of darkness, the annihilator, the end of all, but also the night which precedes and thus implicitly allows creation. For such is the Kala Kid too. I have elucidated upon the meaning field of Kaal and how and why it encompasses both death and time inter alia at some length elsewhere, and will not repeat it here. Suffice to say that time destroys everything eventually. It is the fire in which we burn, even before the final fire is to be considered. Kalratri is unquestionably my favourite of the 9 nights, in no small part due to my gratitude for a certain event which occurred upon this date some 5 years ago. Kali worship, or at least honouring and acknowledgement, in some traditions is also a regular feature of Hindu piety. Technically speaking, Kalratri represents a slightly more specific form of the Kali aspect, however, both due to their fundamental identicality of essence, as well as the frequent overlap of myth conceptions around them in the popular consciousness, and quite significant shared mythography attributes, portfolio, and functions and role, I am not making a hard distinction in what follows. And I'd further add that in the Mahabharata there is direct equation of Kali and KaalRatri. In any case, due to the frequent and rather willful misrepresentations and misunderstandings which have been promulgated in Western media over the years, most prominently perhaps a certain film featuring an errant archaeologist, this occasionally comes across as being somewhat surprising or even outright abhorrent to outsiders, the degree of emphasis and proud belief we have in Kali Ma. A strange thing, but I suppose their thought process is that they cannot understand why we would hold in such high regard a deity whose name literally means death, and whose most commonly known cosmic role is to bring about, indeed it straight up is, the end of everything and the destruction of the universe, whose customary depictions show her garlanded with a necklace of skulls, skirted with severed arms, carrying the grisly trophy of a severed head and blood-spattered weaponry, whose gaze is akin to lightning, and whose breath is of fire, amongst many other iconographic elements. And yes, I suppose in that light, we can see why such perplexity is held by non-Hindu audiences when it comes to the veneration of Kali. Yet such prejudice is based largely, if not entirely, upon misperception and misinformation. Myth perception, we might say. For while it is, of course, unquestionably true that Kali and KaalRatri are black and terrifying, are bloody-handed, with all the implicit panic-inducing horror of the night or death, and further, that she will ultimately annihilate the universe at large at the end of the age, this is neither the full story nor any actual evidence of malevolence on her part. For just as, and I mean this quite literally, the motivation and context or circumstance is what transforms the killing of another from murder into the justified defense by a mother of her child, so too with Mata Kali, and not least due to the incredible feats of strength and endurance over and above her usual limits which a mother is capable of when her progeny are under threat. Her terror-inducing appearance and supreme ferocity of visage are there because of what she must contend with on our behalf. That old quip about how she who fights monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster, it does not apply here, for instead she, Parvati, Uma, Durga, has become something terrific, at least partially in the older sense of the term, a begetter of terror. Not a monster, not a demon, but rather a being capable of besting even the mightiest of those adversarial perils arrayed against us. For what can stand against death? What can be more vast or overpowering than the night? Only Shakti, only the sun, and she is also both, albeit in different guises, and which is almost singularly capable of confronting existential threats up to and including corrupted existence itself. For such the degenerated fabric of the cosmos becomes by the end of the appointed tapestry of time. What is capable of confronting such things and winning? That is, to reference a certain filmic portrayal of her husband, or sort of, what she does, she wins. So, if she is the very personification of terror and death to the demons whom she unveils to oppose, then what is she to us? Well, once again, a mother, a protector, a champion, an illuminator, a liberator, a benefactor, a caretaker, a guide. If we are imperiled, she will come forth and defend us. If we are struck down, she will avenge. And as and when we die, and find ourselves transported one way or another to the smashana, the cremation ground, she will be there, with open arms to welcome us home. Nilaya, with Nil Aya, so to speak. That's a pun there for the blue steel. Nil being blue, Aya metal, steel. And as applies her nature as the night. Well, it is a funny thing, but even though we, as human beings, are most used to seeing things when they are well illuminated by the broad and bright rays of the sun, or some indoor simulacrum thereof, there are some things, some truths, that can only really be understood in darkness. Think of the stars, for instance. They do not go away when the sun shines in the heavens above us, yet they are imperceptible unless the sun sets and night instead ascends into place. The sparkling allure of the Jyotisha is not false, it's just hidden. Nilaya, it would seem, is correlated with nighttime in a number of senses. Kali as night, then, is prayed to not just for protection, for while the night may be dark and seem full of terrors, she is, to quote Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the elder and more terrible, from their perspective anyway. She is also prayed to for illumination, as paradoxical as that might first seem. There is much wisdom that in the manner of moon runes or twilight language, or simply having the freedom and space to think once the noise and bustle of the day is done, which only reveals itself, or which can be divined after dark. Hence, no doubt, part of the reasoning for the owl, with its keen eyes in the dark, having such prominence as a symbol of wisdom in Western culture. It may derive from Athena, but consider after the famous Hegel quote, "The owl of Minerva only takes flight when the shades of night are gathering," which also, now that I think upon it, relates back to notions of time and to telos. The hidden wisdom and the light of the moon within the night, along with her general theme of the severing of ensnarements, also explain why she is prayed to in order to ask that magical curses be lifted from us. It should therefore come as no surprise that she finds association, in some traditions, with the Sahasrara, the crown chakra, which exists beyond and above the Ajna, the third eye chakra, keyed to Ma as Katyayani. After all, the elevated activity of that point of empowered enlightenment is generally only to be found amidst those who have successfully destroyed the delusions, particularly with the aid of seeing clearly, via the third eye. They've loosened the restraints of previous action, karma, and are therefore fundamentally closer to the source, to eternity, and thus liberation, in whatever sense that may mean, depending upon the yogic tradition involved and entailed, and rebirth in the sense of something greater. To situate Kalratri within the overarching NavaDurga mythic context, then, it is clear to see how she represents the continuance of Katyayani. For whereas Ma as Katyayani is the supreme, the solar warrior, the force of creation emanated down to this plane to dispatch and destroy threats to the realm and to the gods, Ma as Kali is the supreme, the nocturnal annihilator, the force of cosmic destruction brought into being to handle even more intractable threats, and therefore also the destroyer of the asuric darkness, so to speak, as well as the embodiment of the divine night, and even to unmake reality itself when it can no more be corrupted, in order that the whole cyclical process of cosmogenesis might start all over once more. And once then she is both the elevation and the antithesis of much of the NavRatri cycle which has gone before, the continued escalation of Devi's furious anger and prowess at conflict from the birth pangs of Skanda, through to the victorious blades of Katyayani, and on to an incandescent rage which burns so far beyond white hot that it appears to our eyes to be blackness, like the invisible cutting blade of a plasma torch which can unmake virtually anything it touches in an instant. Yet in another sense, which looks forward also to the next form, Mahagauri, the Great White One, who is peace, Kalratri represents both death, which is the natural fruit of Katyayani, the warrior's efforts, as well as the pathway of transcending through death, I daren't say overcoming, so that the further ascension of the soul may occur. To the state represented by Mahagauri, the situation beyond death, both in the context of the NavaDurgas and, in to phrase it perhaps ironically, life in general. The end, which is not final. The interpretation, and for that matter, our others, as mentioned above, is further substantiated via the linguistic analysis which we have carried out on the likely Proto-Indo-European roots of the term Kali. For it appears plainly obvious that Kel, meaning cover, that is to say to obscure, to shelter, but also to protect or to hide, lies at the heart of it. Descendant terms from this stem in Western Indo-European languages include the Germanic hall as well as hell. The sense here, as applies the former, is a covered place, a shelter, and as applies the latter, in addition perhaps to the under part of the underworld, cf. Hole, is something more properly rendered figuratively and idiomatically beyond the veil, beyond the ken of mortal comprehension, particularly in the post-life, for such as death, both the transitive moment of demise, that being the veil, as well as the journey through it, and the ongoing persistent state and or place beyond and after. It also underpins helmet, that is to say a protective covering of the head, a skeleton and skull, the idea being that something which was covered now isn't, a grim sign of mortality. It occurs in Latin words such as clam, from which we get clandestine, thus protecting secrets in order that they may be transmitted only to those appropriate. Cilium, meaning the lid of the eye, and colour, which means exactly what you think it does, especially as applies an external appearance, a tincture, and in Greek, kolios, a sheath. This is of particular relevancy given the array of Kali mythology, wherein the black skin of the goddess is discarded to reveal Parvati once more in all her fairness, having been all this time, so to speak, within. As a brief tangent, this also occurs directly in Greek mythology, wherein Demeter Erenyes, the frenzied, furious form of the Earth Mother, becomes black, and then washes off this black exterior coating once she is placated, interestingly enough by, who's the goddess in question? By Hecate turning up to assuage her previous concerns. So as we can see, and as I'll detail in a future article, this is a broad pan-Indo-European trope. But back to where we were in the text. It also turns up in Califos, a shell, particularly of an egg, which to my mind recalls the identification of Devi, particularly as Kushmanda, with the Hiranyagarbha, the cosmic egg. Not so much because eggs have shells, of course, but rather because something so precious as the womb of all life quite clearly requires protecting. Indeed, quote a maxim of Winston Churchill, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Gosh, I didn't even have to change the gender. Although I am, of course, not meaning to conflate the aspect of Devi with lies, only with occlusion and vastly necessary concealment. Interestingly, the Sanskrit term sarana, is also hypothesized to have sprung from a similar altered origin point, taking a look at its ambit of meaning, which includes a home, a refuge, a protection, defense, but also help and support, and killing or wounding. It is not hard at all to see why this is thought to be so. Although its additional meaning, as one of the arrows of Kamadeva, may seem somewhat peculiar, up until one considers the closely related Sanskrit term, Dharman. Happiness, bliss, prosperity, safety, shelter, succor, and comfort. And reportedly, according to later ancient commentaries, such as the Aitreya Brahmana and Kaushika Sutra, other resonant meanings, such as Vach and Sarva. This correlates with two theorems we have previously encountered, as experienced readers may be aware. One being the wife of the great god Mahadeva, the other being a form either of Shiva himself or possibly of one of his hounds. I have previously personally observed the former, and how this then unfurled both through and to all the others, that in terms of the meanings which I have previously mentioned. In terms of the mythology surrounding Kalratri, we can see all of the above in beautiful whirling violent motion, the instances wherein she is invoked by the gods to devastate this or that demon invasion by destroying its animating commanders. These clearly show her as protector, while those occurrences wherein this takes place pretty much at the gates or even within the divine realm itself further show her as the active manifestation of that principle of refuge of home, although hearth is perhaps less accurate than cremation ground, for obvious reasons pertaining both to the fate of the world, to the fate of those would-be invaders, as well as her more usual preferred demon's name. I jumped ahead a bit in terms of describing it as the fate of the world, because it's not inaccurate in terms of the world of cremation pyre. It's just a little early for that to be occurring. On a more figurative level, with the demons taken as a symbolic of delusions and impurities of thought or action, Kali's role as the unparalleled destroyer thus connotes her ability to assist the devotees in a similar manner, by removing said impediments towards righteous conduct and enlightenment. Additionally, the characterization of a number of these previous demons, wherein they have this or that overbearing weakness of character, such as arrogance, the heedless and headlong, shortly to be headless, drive for power, or their being dominated by their appetites, and of course, almost by definition, their impiety, which ultimately leads to their undoing at her blessed hands. These provide us with an ample set of exemplary lessons in the ways in which that which we ask Kali to destroy in us can, if left unchecked, easily destroy us instead. However, due to her total mastery over that which is contained within her, she is not restricted merely to the removal of illusions and to the conveyance of wisdom to her devotee. Rather, she is also the most adroit at the craft and construction of begulliaments, ensnarements of the mind and will, which shroud truth, and thus, in the manner of a burial shroud, enwrap their targets. They misdirect adversaries, turn allies against each other, and the enemy's own strengths and powerful attributes against them. Just as she can roll back the night to reveal things to you, the provision of guidance along the less treacherous path through the illumination of, if not outright envelopment and removal of obstacles, so too can she recover that which otherwise became apparent, darken the way of the foeman, beset the night's terrors upon him, and leave him stumbling off a cliff he could not see in front of him, allowing him to send himself plummeting through the night sky into her eternal embrace, that is to say, death. For such is the unrestricted power of Kali, not least due to the potentiality that within the night of space and the space of night is to be found everything and its opposite. Further, it is worth noting that the unmaking of reality at the end of time, the pralaya unto Maya, Maya, interestingly, means both illusion and reality. In the sense of our material reality, we perceive it as being quite different to illusion. This directly shows the unraveling of the veil, which shrouds us, and not always entirely unarguably so, from the absolute that is in Shakti theology, Shakti as Brahman, Ishvari, as she more truly is, above is, I should say. Not only is this clearly correlate with the role inside the devotee's psyche and life, wherein Mother Kali is asked to dissolve delusions and illusions that stand in the way of our enlightenment and pious spiritual progress, but it also suggests a further interpretation of the theonymic title of KaalRatri, the inevitable death of the shroud, and thus the death of time, for time perhaps comes to an end with the passage from the existence of the universe entire, as well as subsequent this, the end of emptiness, for amidst the setting of space, quite literally, she is described in Scripture as possessing the beauty of not only just the night sky, but also the glittering tableau of what we would perhaps refer to as outer space, the not exactly empty void between worlds, this last phase also describing her role between and above creations, which will occur the grandest possible revelation into darkness, that of the new dawn, of the unfurling truth, of the new reality in the space vacated I should say, by the old one, which can only then begin. The myth of the slaying of Raktabija, bloodseed, in particular also springs to mind, both as illustration of Devi's qualities when she has assumed the Kali form, but also of its value as a subversion and destruction of the misperception some have of Kali as something akin to a mindless berserker. The precise details of the legend will not be gone into here, but suffice to say that at the height of the latest demonic onslaught, to attempt to assail the gods, things started to go wrong. Devi had already manifested as Durga, and more than that, as an array of other aspects simultaneously, with the combined host carrying out a valorous charge into the heart of the demonic army, dispatching its foremost fighters, for the most part, with almost contemptuous ease. That was until the appearance of Raktabija upon the field of battle. Now this demon was already allegedly the incarnated father of Mahishasura, whom we met under the feet of Katyayani in last night's commentary. And whether he had learned from the fates of the previous Asuric assailants against the gods, or was simply smarter than the vast majority of they, I do not know. However it transpired, the nature of the boon which Raktabija had acquired was fairly uniquely well suited for withstanding the ferocious onslaught of the enraged warrior forms of Parvati. For his name was not coincidental. For every drop of blood spilled which hit the ground, another Raktabija clone would spring up, in a manner perhaps somewhat akin to the Hydra head phenomenon encountered by Heracles or Hercules in Greco-Roman myth. This presented a clear obstacle to the Devi Nine host, as their customary approach of direct attack with their flashing swords, wailing bows, and other such mechanisms of cutting and piercing the foe had obviously produced quite the exsanguinate profusion all across the field of war. And with it, after a short delay, any additional number of Raktabija warriors had sprouted into being, each of whom also possessed the bloodseed ability of their origin demon. As can quite horrifically be anticipated, this thus meant that the Raktabija, and therefore demonic problem, was growing at a pretty much exponential rate. The Devi Sena, lacking other tools to combat the Raktabijas and to keep them at bay than with their weapons, and yet worsening their overall position every time they put them to their intended use. Yet if Devi is infinitely powerful, she is also infinitely clever, and therefore the Kali form was called upon. KaalRatri thus appeared upon the battlefield, with all the immense majesty and stature of night, and all the annihilative power of quite literally apocalyptic fury. Perceiving instantly the problem that had thus led to these swarming hordes of swiftly reproducing demons sprawling across what was supposed to be her kill zone, she took action, furling out her immense tongue and utilizing her greatest deft and dexterity, as well as the speed of darkness of night, which is always there just before light is. She proceeded to catch with her tongue each drop of blood as it was shed, and before it could touch the ground, thus explaining or at least helping to explain why she is customarily depicted with a pronouncedly long tongue, and a mouth that is surrounded by blood. This at least brought a halt to the worsening of the situation. But how was she to vanquish Raktabija and eliminate this most recent Adamic threat? One solution was to simply bleed them dry, quite literally, hoping that sustained blood loss and other such grievous wounds would incapacitate the Raktabijas, while her darting tongue continued to intercept any blood that was thus shed, so as to avoid reinforcing the adversary in so doing. Another perhaps might be the noose. A suffocation, after all, would present a bloodless means to exterminate the foe, albeit subject to the difficulty of catching them and then deploying the strangulation, without letting any blood touch the earth. KaalRatri, however, chose a much more expansive course, utilizing the supreme and all-enveloping power of the night. She simply proceeded to envelop and devour within her darkness the ravening horde entire. This then is the awe-inspiring potency of Mother Kali, to encompass all just as time and night can touch all things, to envelop even the mightiest host and the strongest foes in exactly the manner that the departure of day covers everything within her shroud, to end anything, for nothing can stand against the relentless march of time in the end, and everything which has a beginning also possesses a death. Yet it also shows these most formidable powers and elements of nature being deployed towards positive, noble goals, the protection of her kinsfolk, the gods, and via this the upholding and maintenance of Dharma within our universe. Further, the results of this combat of annihilation is to make clear the way for life, love, and light in its wake, and free, for the moment and for the most part, from the overbearing and stifling threat that had nearly wiped it out, without chance for easy resurrection. Or, in other words, exactly what her role with the pralaya, the grand unraveling of the world and the end of time, is to accomplish, is to do. The fact that this is all done with intelligence, creativity, and perspicacity clearly demonstrates the supreme sapience and clarity of thinking, which can oft only be found, for me at least, amidst the night, while also carrying out that much-needed disintegration of the lamentable misperception of her as simply an unthinking onrushing tide of doom and devastation, akin to the automatism of an earthquake-triggered tsunami. She may indeed be a most powerful and all-consuming inevitability, with the inexorability and implacability of the heat-death of the universe. But that most definitely does not mean that she is anything less than superlatively wise. After all, have not death, and time, and night, and the presence at both beginning and the end of creation seen and digested? Just about everything between them. Having said that, though, I maintain that the lesson of KaalRatri contra Raktabija is appropriately enough a deceptively simple one, not least due to its dual nature. Namely, that there are indeed some situations and some seemingly severe obstacles to which an absolute, even all-consuming anger is exactly the right element to bring to the table. But also, that even at its apex of intensity, one should never discard intelligence. For to do so, particularly in the high-pressure environment of, and perhaps invited by, a furiously aggressive response, is to invite your problems to multiply until they might even be able to overwhelm you, or at the very least may leave you battling them for an eternity. Therefore, it is the essential unity of these elements, of the hot head and the brain within, elements we often rather artificially consider to be innately separate, as well as, it must be said, with the adroit tongue to express these fundamentally important faculties reach and grasp, which makes for the most fearsome and formidable combatant. See also, I suspect, Minerva, Athena. There is also, in some folklore surrounding the above myth, another lesson, namely the importance of self-control and of discernment. For it is said, in these popular tellings of the legend, that upon slaying Raktabija, and having laid waste to the remainder of the demon army, via her inimitable combination of proficient fury and furious proficiency. She had become perhaps blood-drunk, immersed in a potentially apocalyptic frenzy of annihilation, possibly as the result of the not insignificant effort entailed in ending and containing the Raktabija threat, causing something to lock in her and therefore constraining her ability to end the slaughter. Indeed, perhaps even to adequately distinguish friend from foe. Had this battle rage been allowed to persist unchecked, it would ultimately have resulted in the omnicide, the premature desolation, disintegration, and eventual dissolution of the universe entire. As it was in these folk-tellings, Lord Shiva perceives the imminent trajectory to the cataclysm, and directly interposes himself upon her path in order to bring a halt to the mightiest madness. In some versions, she kills him, as something otherwise basically impossible in both senses, not realizing his identity, whereas in others, she merely tramples him after he throws himself underfoot. In either case, she suddenly realizes with horror what she is reputed to have done, and overwhelmed with shame and guilt, she ceases her rampage of destruction forthwith. This also, as it happens, provides another explanation for her long and prominent tongue in iconographic depictions, as it is a gesture of contrition and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Consider or compare the English idiom to bite one's tongue, which can easily connote the idea of not embarrassing oneself further, via ill-considered actions or speech, to add to what had already transpired, or otherwise simply self-restraint, hopefully preventing such irascibility from eventuating in the first place, as something which places in an entirely different and interesting light the utilization of said tongue to undo the demonic army earlier in the episode, as it suggests that contrition is the natural antidote and destroyer of the arrogance and other moral failings personified by the demonic there. In any case, the panoply and associated iconography of Mother Kali is a fascinating subject in its own right, which we shall only briefly delve into here. The standard depiction of Kali as KaalRatri features the aspect of the goddess seated upon a donkey, bearing both a lethally curved long sword, often spattered with the blood about its upper crescent blade, representing both death and the ability to sever delusions, as well as the ties of karma for a devotee, as well as the Vajra, the thunder weapon, often associated with both Lord Indra, and with rulership and or the maintenance and upholding of dharma, therethrough, from, and with. Interestingly, and this is a point we shall return to later, in Puranic era traditions, the Vajra is regarded as having been made from the bones of the sage Deity, in part because of an Asura who could not be killed by any living warrior, and so therefore was brought low via a superweapon made from a particularly virtuous deceased. While her hands are posed in the Abhaya and Varada mudras, representing and imbuing the steeling of nerves, the removal of fear, and the sharpening of acuity, and the beneficence, the bequeathing of boons respectively. Her hair radiates out in wild and untamed vastness, thus symbolizing the unbridled and unconstrained and expansive nature of, nature, and most especially her. Some depictions emphasize a more aged or even outright haggard or corpse-like appearance to emphasize the destroying and eroding nature of time, visages and accompanying physique that would eclipse even the most shocking Faces of Meth advert. However, this is not by any means the only appearance possible, and scripture even quite pointedly and repeatedly emphasizes her divine beauty at various junctures and in various occurrences. For what can be more beautiful than the night sky? The depiction I have chosen to illustrate the written form of this article, which you can find linked below, is very much in the latter of these two camps, although that is not quite why I have selected this representation of her. To my mind, this image represents in its essence and the feelings it should most surely inspire in the viewer the best conveyance, I daren't say encapsulation, for how could one possibly encapsulate the infinite? The best conveyance of Kali that I have yet had the pleasure to behold in 2 or even 3 dimensions, the fourth of course being time herself. and in both of these senses as well, I have experienced darshana every now and then. Yet in truth, as sufficient as that is and should be, it is not the reason entire either. But more on that towards the conclusion. First, let us appreciate this image. Every time I gaze upon it for long enough, I find something new to appreciate, a slow process of unfolding that has persisted these past few years in earnest. For reasons of brevity, I shall not go into exhaustive detail upon everything that I have perceived in it, and instead endeavour to keep largely to the iconographic elements of Kali in particular. The sword and the blood-spattered mouth have been covered above, with the addition of the mouth's yawning vastness signifying both her universe-trembling roar, akin to her husband too, Rudra, the roarer, as well as her all-consuming, devouring facility as night and the end of time, as have two of the three more prominent explanations for the tongue. The third of which pertains to one of the 7 tongues of Agni, the black one, the destroyer, thus continuing the strong fire symbolism most appropriately apt for the fire at the end of time. Her husband is also known as Kalagni Rudraya, as it happens. Indeed, as it happens, the fire at the end of time. The long staff held crosswise in her lowest 2 arms is the Katvanga, the skull staff that is something of a badge or staff of office for various orders of Shaivite and or Shakta renunciate monks, who habitually associate with the charnel environs of the cremation ground or other such places of desolation, and may not just have made a friend of death through long-standing relationship, but perhaps have inflicted it upon others, a Brahmin even, thus necessitating their long periods of rather solitary and austere existence. However, the Katvanga also represents the Vajra, and as explained above in the recent detailing of the Vajra held by the customary depictions of Kalratri, it is linked in Puranic era scripture to the death of a Brahmin via the utilization of sage Dadichi's bones to make the weapon in question. Righteousness and death and righteousness, a most formidable entwining of concepts indeed. As a brief discussion from the text, I will also note that the most famous Katvanga is that carried by Bhairava, Terra himself, the emanation of Rudra, who is dispatched in order to decapitate Brahma and literally cut him down to size in the Puranic era telling of this particular myth, wherein Brahma's immense arrogance had caused great cosmic disruption, thus necessitating the dispatch of this warrior form to utilize what we call the Rudran theological argument to establish Shaivite supremacy via the application of axe to neck. So in this particular regard, you can see once again the Katvanga as being representative of quite an ultimate power in the universe if it's capable of subduing even mighty Brahma. And in the manner of a Brahmastra class of weapon, which is empowered, you might say, via the force of Brahman, the force of the Absolute, the force of the universe, the Katvanga can be seen in exactly that light, especially when it is carried by Ma Kali, who is acting, we might say, in something of a counterpart role to the terrifying black enforcer form that is Bhairava, although she, I would say, with a slightly biased hat on, is rather greater indeed. But I digress. The 3-pointed spear held in Devi's second from top left hand is none other than the Trishula, the iconic weapon of Mahadev, whose 3 points symbolize rulership over the 3 worlds and mastery over the 3 qualities, i.e. dominion over the universe entire, and also forms one of the many linkages within this image back to Lord Shiva. Interestingly, it is also somewhat coterminous with the Vajra in some key respect of its symbolism. It also bears the damaru, the drum whose repeated beats, customarily generated by rapidly rotating the trishula back and forth, so that beaters attached to strings hit each drum skin repeatedly and with consistent frequency. These beats regulate the flow and cycle of the universe, not least through providing the rhythm to the dance of the Natharaja aspect of Mahadeva, which creates and maintains, and eventually unmakes all. With the Trishula representing both rulership and ultimate destruction, and the Damaru connoting law beyond agency, that is to say intrinsic rule, and the universe's ongoing cycle of existence as it unfolds, the linkage between them, where the Damaru is tied to the Trishula shaft, represents the essential balance of creation and destruction, as well as the fact that, at least for now, the universe remains in being. The strings and fixtures perhaps correlate with those super strings, I should say, which form the fundamental fabric of creation. For more detail upon the three-spear, please consult my relevant and recently published work, which is directly entitled on the Trishula Gangar Pinaka of Odin and Shiva, amongst many other terms. You can find it on our website. Other weaponry borne by this particular depiction of Devi include the chakra, about her uppermost left-hand raised finger. This is the weapon often regarded as linked to Sri Vishnu and his avatars, representing both the inescapability of the bearer's wrath, due to its incredible range and unerring accuracy, as well as through its 108 ultra-razor-sharp, supernal sharpened bladed edges and its wheel-like shape, Dharma itself. It is thus both a potent weapon of both piety and praiseworthy lethality, a characteristic which it shares with the conch-shaped shell carried in Devi's second lowest right hand. This horn is usually associated with Lords Varuna and Hanuman, in addition to its use in Hindu rituals, and it is also a war trumpet. It blasts a rallying sound which resounds and reverberates even into the hearer's very soul, bolstering the resolve and gladdening the hearts of friends and allies of the gods, and inflicting terror, discord, and disunity amidst our foes. As a brief note about these weapons and other items more usually associated with other, often male gods, well, one interpretation is that they have given her their signature devices as a form of empowerment, and the gesture of unity against truly terrible foes. The Shakta interpretation goes the other way around, so to speak, namely, that these weapons and their powers that they are keyed to and represent are actually Devi's, and that she has invested in them, in the universe, and given them out to the gods, who are their more frequently recognized bearers. Thus, it is arguably not a case of her being the temporary beneficiary of the gods' goodwill in order to confront some momentary threat, but rather one of her as the benefactor to the gods, and both still holding in perpetuity and reclaiming these boons as necessary, for she is Shakti, and thus the root power of all. The final object in Devi's hands is a severed head in her second uppermost right. This symbolizes not only the defeated and decapitated foes of Kali, and the inevitability of such fate for all those who would stand against the goddess, but in more positive terms, it represents that she has detached, utilizing the sword, whose additional purpose I elucidated somewhat earlier. She has detached somebody from overbearing ego, from delusion, i.e. the soul has been emancipated from the shackling of mortal material existence at a stroke, and has thus hastened their pathway towards spiritual growth, elevation, enlightenment, and eventual empowerment to be free. This is a relatively common motif within Hindu iconography and mythography. Consider, for instance, the decapitation of Brahma by Bhairava, of Daksha by Virabhadra and Bhadrakali, and of Chinnamasta by herself, whereas the final hand, the second lowermost left, is in the mudra pose, likely to be the Abhaya, which we have encountered with regularity in the depictions of Durga Devi elsewhere throughout these articles. Its role and its function of the bestowment of bravery, bolstering via the boon of divine protection, and the sharpening of the mind through the removal of worry, is most welcome when we are in her terrific presence. Moving now to the adornments. One of the first things that likely jumps out at us here is the Mundamala, the garland or necklace of skulls. These once again represent both Devi's defeated enemies, as well as something far greater. For the several dozen, often intended as 50, 51 or 52, of them represent the letters of the Sanskrit language, and thus signify the supreme knowledge and wisdom of the bearer. For us, language and facility therewith is power, as Sanskrit is the language of creation, and simply by speaking the right syllables with the right intent and presence and state of mind, This can literally move mountains, or blast them asunder, in a manner akin to a modern-day nuclear weapon. Having command of the entire syllabary of Sanskrit, therefore, speaks to the mastery over creation of the glorious figure who possesses such. And I should note at this point that Devi actually has power over more than just the skin of Sanskrit language, which is within the mortal ken. There's a broad Vedic conceptry around this, whereby she's basically just given us a quarter of the power in question, which is eminently responsible on her part, I should perhaps say. The command over language can also be perceived as having the knowledge and wisdom accumulated by many such sages, hence owning their heads and their contents in a manner rather akin to Urn with Mimir, as well as, due to the looped nature of the bedeckment, the cyclical existence of the universe. The fact that Devi stands within them, through their circlet, and further, and more importantly, that they hang on her, shows her transcension of cyclical time, as well as her status as Adi Shakti within the universe, which the universe is contingent and dependent upon in exactly the same manner, even and especially as she largely remains beyond it and beyond time itself and space. Kali is also known by the epithet Mundamali, garlanded with skulls, the wearer of the skull necklace. The circles of fire behind her have similar meaning. Cyclical time, with time again igneous, connoted due to its corroding effect upon all that is immersed within it, with the sun at its center, behind her as the localized empowerment. Again, keyed to her, cf. the Kushmanda form of Devi, that is in many ways Kali's opposite, yet resonant alter ego, so to speak. A Shakti, but also eclipsed after a sort, via her standing directly in front of it here. And meanwhile, the juxtaposition of these skulls, with their representations inter alia of the mastery of the spoken word, with the extended tongue and its customary symbolism of wordless, speechless expression, representing yet another union of contraries within the figure of Kali. Next we shall notice her skirts, the first one of which is comprised of severed arms. This accoutrement is not merely there to look grisly, but rather the hands and the arms they stem from signify actions, with the severance of them, again accomplished by that most excellent of swords she is holding aloft as if to swing here. These show us how she can liberate from the ties of karma, and indeed take on our burden of karma for us, especially if we too are actually capable of allowing her to and letting go, as well as, one presumes, displaying in a manner perhaps not entirely dissimilar to certain criminal codes. This is what happens to the hand and the arm which is used for evil, which is raised in would-be violence against me. Beneath this again we have a tiger skin. This is an iconographic resonance with the traditional depiction of her husband Mahadev, and also frequently utilized in a similar manner by various forms of often Shaivite priests. It is quite a thing to subdue a tiger, and hence it carries connotations of not just serious spiritual authority, but also of being something of a wild man or a wild woman, a fierce combatant at home in the wilderness, yet with patience and poise and insight and learning, knowledge and erudition, as well as being, on top of that, in a rather literal sense, one's bestial nature. And it is utterly uncoincidental, I assume, that Dionysus, also of flowing black hair as it happens, is depicted wearing a leopard print garment. For more upon that, you can check my articles upon the Dionysian subject. Moving upwards, it cannot have escaped notice that Devi is here largely Digambara, that is to say, sky-clad, or, well, not entirely naked, but unclothed. This represents her unfettered nature, and usually in humans is often considered a sign of craziness. After all, if you see somebody walking around in a state of undress, it is rarely considered a sign of mental stability and well-adjustment, even if you happen to be an emperor with new clothes. However, it also here represents her radiant astral beauty, with the dark coloration of her skin signifying the hues and context of the night sky replete with stars and galaxies, the latter dimly visible within. One cannot encapsulate space, nor can one truly shroud the absolute beauty that is the truth, that is Shakti. Hence, as she is above and beyond the obscuration of Maya, that is to say, illusion, and also the material reality, as well as outside of society in many ways, so too is she not bound by the societal convention of a more concealing, modest attire. The unadornedness of her form in this regard also shows us the nature of the universe. For just as her skin and complexion is said to represent the space before time began, and the universe unfolded with structure and thence with life, also the structure to which it will return following the pralaya, the grand unraveling at the end of time, so too does this lack of superstructure of clothing, beyond what has already been aforementioned, the skirt of severed limbs, indeed, further implying a lack of a certain causality superstructure, which one would presume in a time before time, as well as a time over time, and a time against time, such as this. All of this shows the nature of the universe prior to any projections of creation occurring upon it. Upon her brow, and continuing the celestial theme, we see a sliver of a moon. This is, as you will recall from the previous commentary upon the Chandraganta aspect of Devi, both a resonance of Chandrasekhara, the brow adorned and crowned with moon epithet and description of her husband Mahadev, as well as an association with Soma, the empowering elixir. A similar substance is said to be particularly associated with Kali's forehead. In addition to the lunar linkages of Soma itself and himself, as shall also be recalled from the Chandraganta commentary, the light of the moon is also a powerful illuminator, generally only rarely visible during the night, which shows us hidden things, or things as they actually are, rather than as they merely appear to be, and dispels fear while donating empowerment, a perfect symbolism for Kali then, who even as the blackest night carries out all of these roles, especially within her. The axis of sun, fire, and moon, running from behind Devi to her brow, also signifies three incredibly significant forces of nature, as well as recalling the ancient Dharmic proverb of the three things that cannot long be hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. In addition to the lightning of the Vajra, and the resonance of the Damaru, as well as the supreme radiance of Devi's eyes, and the lashing of her fiery tongue amidst the glinting of her teeth, they represent the key forms of illumination and energy in this world. The three eyes, meanwhile, eyes widened in rage, but also in perspicacity, signify her great fury, but also great wisdom. Truly eyes as wisdom to the windows to the soul. The third eye, in particular, able to unmake illusion with but a glance, and thus destroy what is false. For a given, almost everything in this universe is false, potentially definition of false, as soon as it is perceived to be so, i.e. pretty much near instantly. The three eyes additionally represent her perfect vision of the past, the present, and the future. This also recalls the traditional iconography of Mahadev, who is himself referred to as Triambakam, the three-eyed one, as, not at all coincidentally, is Mother Kali, in various mantras and scriptures, against the dark radiant luster of her sacred skin, which additionally symbolizes the fundamental unknowability of she who is beyond reality by those of us inside her. Several other adornments also stand out, their sparkles shining all the brighter upon such astral backdrop. Upon her ears we see earrings, and while it is very difficult to tell given the size of the image, I really should endeavour to procure a wall-hanging sized iteration at some point, there is a very reasonable likelihood that these are the human fetus earrings with which she is occasionally depicted. These represent the gift of life, for not only are they precious and prettiful, but they light up the night and render the surface of the universe upon which we all stand a more beauteous place for their presence and luster, just as our lives do for Devi, who delights in them. About her neck is lined arrays of necklaces, including amongst their number the chain of stars, for such are the jewels and the beauty of the night sky, the mightiest beacons of light and axes of life contained within our material universe, rendered mere constituent secondary gems, the size of pinpricks in the darkness by comparison. Another chain runs from her all-apprehending ear to her nostril, meeting with a rather larger circlet ring set with a pearl, as is the tradition for a woman of her august stature. Running round her upper arms are bands of gold and other precious substances, helping to recall the epithet of Mahadev, Hiranyabahu, and rendering her blessed arms rapidly flashing like lightning or plasma storms when they are engaged in the rapid whirling and rise and fall of both dance and sword choreography of lethal ambit. Speaking of dance, her ankles bear the nupur, the traditional anklet adornments often worn by dancers. This too links her back to her husband, while also illuminating her role as cosmic dancer in her own right. As noted in previous pieces, both Shiva and Uma are regarded in hymnals, and scripture as being akin to actors, dancers, performers on the stage that is the cosmos, and the upholding of the universe, which is but a play. This also helps to explain their rather elaborate costumes and role changes, while still being the same underneath. Now earlier, I had said there were two reasons for my selection of this image to post. The first has been elucidated. The second is because this is the murti I posted on that most auspicious day 5 years ago, upon Kalratri in late 2015. A day on which I was very much in need of protection, refuge and support. The dual empowerments of courage and sharp wits with a sharper tongue, and the correlate disempowerment of adversaries against me, especially as applied, the power of speech and perceived facts. These most bounteous boons, amidst many others, were provided for and to me, and via her powers, and those of related members of the Pantheon, I did indeed find my way home. But that is, perhaps, another story for another time. Suffice to say that I have never forgotten this, and I never intend to either. Cattle may die, kinsfolk may die, as do we, and ultimately does the universe, the cosmos entire. Yet in some sense, memory is eternal. It just gets shrouded from time to time. The Havamal cites that the renown of the noble deed, in the sense, is immortal also. And though it is, in the grand scheme of things, perhaps a small thing, my gratitude to the noble death and her kin cannot be overstated, and is similarly, not least through the sense of sanskara, undying. I therefore post this image upon Kalratri each year as a mark of thanks, to honour the favour thus bestowed, and commemorate the occasion. And, as noted above, it is also an absolutely excellent essence presentation. This is also why I was at temple earlier this evening, as you may have guessed. It is right, righteous and proper to honour one's Ma. After all, she is time, and she is on my side. Jai Mata Di. Hail to Mother Kali.